The betrothal feast at Thornreach was meant to be a triumph, and for the first 3 hours it was. 200 candles burned in the great hall, their light running gold over the silver and the smoked glass, and the faces of the northern gentry who had ridden 3 days through autumn mud to see the Duke of Corvain bind his house to the house of Vale. Lady Ismene Vale sat at Lord Aldrich's right hand, jeweled and lovely and cold as a struck coin. The toasts had gone round twice, the harpers played, and everyone agreed it was a very great match and a very great occasion. Rowan carried wine. She moved down the long tables with a ewer of claret against her hip, filling cups where they were raised to her, keeping her eyes at the level of men's collars as a serving woman must, and she was by every measure that mattered, in that hall, invisible. No one looked at the girl in the gray stuff gown. No one ever did. It was the single condition on which her whole purpose depended, and she guarded her invisibility the way another woman might guard jewels. She had served at Thornreach 11 weeks under a name not her own, learning its passages, its people, the habits of its staff, and she had waited, as she had told no one she was waiting, for a night the house would be too full and too dazzled to notice one maid slip where she should not go. A feast. Like this one. She had not expected it to break the way it did. It began with a dropped cup. Lady Ismene, gesturing to make some point to the table, struck her own goblet with the back of her hand, and it went over, and a red tongue of wine ran across the white cloth and down toward her skirts. Rowan was nearest. She did what any trained servant would do without thought, stepped in, righted the cup, laid her own cloth over the spreading stain, and reached to draw Lady Ismene's sleeve clear of the wine before it could reach the silk. Her fingers brushed the lady's wrist. It was nothing. It was less than nothing. The automatic courtesy of a servant sparing a great lady's gown. But Lady Ismene snatched her arm back, as though she had been touched by something diseased, and her voice, wine-loosened and pitched to carry, cut clean across the harpers. "You dare put your hands on me?" The hall did not fall silent all at once. It fell in a spreading ring, table by table, as heads turned and conversations died, until the only sound was the fire and the last uncertain note of a harp string let go. Rowan stepped back and lowered her eyes and did the only thing there was to do. "Forgive me, my lady." "The wine, I meant only to spare your gown. You meant to draw notice to yourself." Ismene's beautiful face had gone tight and ugly. "I've watched you creep about this hall all evening. Do you imagine no one sees it? A grasping little nobody, forever underfoot, where her betters are gathered. It was unjust, and it was public, and there was no answer to it that would not make it worse." Rowan held her tongue and held her ground, and kept her eyes down, and she might have weathered it. A great lady's temper spends itself, given nothing to burn, had the Duke not chosen that moment to speak. Lord Aldrich of Corvain had been watching from the head of the table with the tired distaste of a man whose feast has been spoiled. He was not a cruel man, whatever else he was, but he was a proud one, newly grieved and freshly betrothed and desperate. That this night of all nights proceed as it ought, and the girl frozen before his intended bride was in that moment simply the thing that had gone wrong. He reached for the surest instrument of order he possessed, the plain fact of who stood where. "Enough," he said, and the hall gave him its silence. He looked at Rowan, truly looked at her perhaps for the first time, though he would not remember it so, and what he saw was a serving girl who had disordered his table. "You will apologize to Lady Vale," he said, "and you will remember, girl, what you are. There are those born to sit at this table, and those born to carry to it, and the distance between them is not crossed by ambition, nor by putting your hands where they are not wanted." His voice was not raised. That was the worst of it. The calm, the certainty, the way he pronounced it like a law of nature. "Whatever it is you imagine for yourself, put it aside. A creature like you will never belong beside me. See that you do not forget it again." Someone at the lower table laughed. It was a small sound, quickly stifled. But Rowan heard it, and she felt the heat climb her throat, and she understood that 40 faces were turned upon her to watch how she would break. She did not break. She sank into a curtsy so correct, so perfectly graceful, that a sharper eye than any in that hall might have wondered where a laundry house nobody had learned it, and said in a voice without a tremor, "As you say, Your Grace." Then she gathered her ewer and walked from the hall at a measured pace, her spine straight, her chin level. And she did not hurry, and she did not let them see her face. Only when the door had closed behind her, and the dark of the servants' passage had taken her, did she stop and press her back to the cold stone and let herself shake. "A creature like you will never belong beside me." She pressed her hand flat against the small tin box in the pocket of her apron, the box she never let another soul touch, the box that held the only proof of who she truly was, and breathed until the shaking passed. He thought he knew what she was. They all did. A nobody, a grasping girl, a thing born to carry. They were wrong. And one day, though she could not yet have said how, she meant to prove it. She did not know. How could she? That a day would come, years off and unimaginable, when the man who had just told her she would never belong beside him would kneel on cold stone before her and not dare to raise his eyes. She knew only that she had work to do, and that she could not be caught. By morning the story had gone everywhere, as such stories do. In the servants' hall, it was told and retold over the porridge, how the wine girl had laid hands on Lady Vale, how the Duke himself had risen to put her in her place before the whole gentry of the north. The tellers arranged themselves into camps, those who thought she had got what she deserved, a very few who thought the Duke had been hard on a girl who only reached for a spill-cloth, and the great remainder who thought only that it was wise now to be seen keeping their distance, for a servant marked by the master's displeasure is a contagion, and Thornreach had long since learned to protect itself. She was quiet. That was the first thing anyone would have told you about her, and the first thing that misled them. She did her work without complaint and without flourish, keeping her thoughts behind a face so composed that the other maids found it unnerving and decided, in the way people do, that a person they could not read must be either stupid or sly. They settled on sly. It was more satisfying. What none of them saw, because none of them thought to look, was everything that did not fit. They did not notice that the wine girl read, not laboring at it, but easily, hungrily, her eye moving down a page of the old Duke's discarded correspondence, as though the Latin folded into it cost her nothing. They did not notice her hands, chapped and reddened by lie, yet long-fingered and fine beneath the damage, the hands of someone once taught that hands mattered. They did not notice how she never spoke of where she came from, deflecting every question with the same soft answer. "A house down south. It's gone now. There's nothing to tell." There was a great deal to tell, but Thornreach had decided what she was on the night of the feast, and a house that has decided a thing does not trouble to look again. One creature in it, however, had never troubled to decide anything by the rules the others used, and it had noticed her from the first. The hawks of Corvain were kept in the old mews at the edge of the East Court, and they were the Duke's pride and his one inheritance from a father he had otherwise mourned in silence. They were tended by Murray, who had been blind for 20 years and a falconer for 60, and whom the whole household held in a wary reverence, bordering on superstition. For a man who cannot see yet knows every bird by its bells, and every soul by the weight of its step, comes in time to seem less a servant than some old spirit the walls had grown around. Rowan had been sent to the mews in her second week to carry Mary his meals because it was a chore no one else wanted. She had not been frightened of the great hooded shapes stirring on their perches. She had felt in them, not menace, but a watchful patience she recognized in herself. On the third such visit, the old man had stopped with his spoon halfway to his mouth and turned his ruined eyes toward her. "You've a stillness on you that most people have to buy with years," he had said. "Where'd a girl your age come by it?" She had not answered, but she had not forgotten it either. Now, in the raw week after the feast, when the whole house had drawn its skirts back from her, she found that the Mews was the one place she was still welcome. Mare did not care what Lady Vale thought, nor what the Duke had said. He asked her nothing about the feast. He only handed her, on the morning after, a strip of tough leather and set her to oiling jesses while he worked beside her, and the ordinary companionable silence of the task was the kindest thing anyone had offered her in 11 weeks. "They'll tell you what you are," he said at last, apropos of nothing, his knotted fingers moving surely over a hood he could not see. "Every soul in that house'll be glad to tell you. Don't take a word of it. They told me for years I was a broken old man good for nothing but the birds. The birds knew better. Birds always do. And what do the birds say of me?" she asked, half smiling, expecting no real answer. Mare turned his face toward her, and for a moment his expression was uncannily like sight. "They don't fret when you come near. There's not a stranger in 10 years the tear cell hasn't roused for. He sits quiet for you." He nodded slowly. "A frightened soul frightens the birds. A false one, worse. You're neither. You're just waiting for something. I won't ask what. But I've kept the reckoning of who's true in this house for 60 years, and I'm not often wrong, and I've made my reckoning of you." She bent her head over the leather so that he could not have heard, had he been able to see how his words had caught at her throat. She said nothing, but something in her wound tight. Since the night in the hall eased by the smallest degree, and neither of them saw the Duke pass the Mews door and slow, for half a step, at the sound of his old falconer speaking gently to the girl he had cast down. Her name was not Eloin Hart. That is to say, Hart was true, the last true thing left to her, but Eloin had been her mother's name, taken up as a shield when her own became too dangerous to carry. She had been born Rowan Merle Calderon, only child of the House of Calderon, and there had been a time not so long past when she would have entered a hall like Thornreach's, not by the servants' passage, but through its great doors, and men would have risen at her coming. That time had ended on a gray morning 2 years before, in a lawyer's chamber that smelled of dust and sealing wax, with the reading of a will that was not her father's. Lord Mara Calderon had been many things: a soldier in his youth, a scholar in his age, a widower who had raised his daughter himself, and taught her, against all custom, everything he knew, the languages, the law, the management of land and coin. He had been, above all, a man of exact and careful honor, and when he died, suddenly, of a fever that took him inside a week, he left behind a great estate at Calderon Cross, a name 3 centuries old, and a single beloved daughter to inherit both. Or so he had intended. What was read aloud in that dusty chamber was a different will entirely, one that left the whole of the Calderon inheritance to Lord Merrick's cousin by marriage, a smooth, soft-spoken man named Corbin Ashfin, and that dismissed the daughter with 100 crowns and a sentence advising her to seek an honest situation. The seal was her father's. The witnesses were Ashfin's men. The lawyer who produced it was not the lawyer her father had used for 30 years. That man had died, most conveniently, the spring before. Rowan had known within a day that it was a forgery, known it in her bones, the way you know a false note in a song. But knowing a thing and proving it are 2 different countries. Ashfin moved with terrible speed. Before she had finished grieving, she was put out of the only home she had ever known. The servants who might have spoken for her were dismissed or bought. The few relations who remained found it easier to believe the will than to quarrel with the man who held the purse. She was warned softly by Ashfin himself to make no trouble, that a girl alone, with no name and no coin, who went about crying forgery would find herself reckoned mad or worse, and then she was nobody. She had spent the first year in a poverty she had never imagined, learning the weight of things she had once taken for granted: warmth, safety, a door that locked. She learned to launder and scrub, because those were the things a fallen gentlewoman could sell, and to keep her learning hidden, because a servant who read Latin invited questions she could not afford. And she learned to bury Rowan Calderon so deep that even she sometimes lost the sound of her own true name. It was a letter that raised her. It came in the second year, forwarded through 3 hands from an old man named Dr. Wren, her father's dearest friend, a fellow scholar tucked away in a college in the South. He had heard, late, of Lord Merrick's death and the strange disposition of his estate, and did not believe a word of it. He remembered his friend's intentions too well, but he remembered something else besides, something that made his old hands shake as he wrote it, that in his last year, fearing exactly the sort of grasping relation who now held Calderon Cross, Lord Merrick had spoken of sending his most precious papers away for safekeeping, the true will, the deeds, and letters that would damn the forger, to the one place no cousin would think to look, to the archive of an old patron in the north, the muniment room of the Dukes of Corvain, where Merrick had once spent a summer cataloguing another man's books, and learned that the safest place for a secret is inside someone else's house. "I cannot swear it is there," the old man had written. "I can swear only that he meant to send it, and that he trusted the old Duke as he trusted few men. If the proof of your birthright survives anywhere in this world, child, it survives at Thornreach. What you do with that knowledge, I leave to your courage. I fear I have little left to offer but this. It was thin. It was a hope built on a dying scholar's memory of a dead man's intention. It was, very possibly, nothing at all. It was everything she had." And so Rowan Calderon had done the thing. Corbin Ashvin, for all his cunning, would never have predicted. She walked toward the danger. She forged references good enough to pass, took her mother's name and her reddened hands in her dangerous learning north, and talked her way into a place among the lowest servants at Corvain. 11 weeks she had been at Thornreach now, mapping its passages, waiting for the single unguarded night that would let her reach the locked room where her father's last gift lay hidden. That was the truth inside the little tin box. She never let another soul touch. Not jewels. A folded letter in a dead scholar's hand, and beneath it a single pressed sprig of rowan, for the name her father had given her, and the name she meant to take back. She had told none of it to Murray, though she thought sometimes that the blind old man had guessed more than he said. She had certainly told none of it to the Duke of Corvain, who did not know she existed, save as a girl he had once put in her place, the master of the very house in which her salvation lay locked, the man whose father's honor was, though neither of them yet knew it, the last thread holding her true name to the world. The audience of a great hall had watched him tell her she would never belong beside him. Only Rowan knew she had not come to Thornreach to belong beside anyone. She had come to take back a crown of her own, not of gold, not yet, but the older and harder crown of a name unjustly stolen. And she was very close now, closer than the whole scornful house could dream. Close enough that a single night and a single locked door stood between Rowan Calderon and everything. The order came down through the understeward on a frostbright morning, and it was precise in the way that cruelty is often precise. Rowan was to be moved from the warm middle house to the laundries below the kitchens, where the air stayed thick with lye and the stone never dried. No reason was given, none was needed. Everyone in Thornreach had heard what the Duke had said in the great hall, and a household takes its temperature from its master. She carried her few possessions down the back stair without complaint. A comb, a folded shawl, the small tin box she never let another soul touch. The laundresses watched her come with the flat curiosity of people deciding whether she would be worth their kindness or their scorn. Rowan gave them neither reason to pity her nor cause to mock. She set her box on the shelf above her cot, tied back her sleeves, and asked where the ringing was done. That composure was itself a kind of defiance, though no one in the room could have named it so. She had learned long ago that grief and anger, spent aloud, only fed the people who caused them. One of the older women, Bet, noticed her hands first, The way the girl handled cloth as if she had once been taught to value fine things, the way she read the maker's mark stitched into the Duke's linens without seeming to try. "You've served in a proper house before," Bet said. It was not a question. "I've served," Rowan answered, and left it there. The work that week was punishing by design, the heaviest loads, the earliest wakings, the tasks others slid off their own shoulders. When a scorched cuff was found on one of the Duke's shirts, scorched by no iron she had touched, it was laid at her feet, and she accepted the blame without protest. It was meant to break her or drive her out, so the household could close over the memory of that night in the hall like water over a dropped stone. What none of them knew was that she could not leave. Not yet. Everything she had crossed 3 counties to find was still inside these walls, and she would scrub every floor in Thornreach before she abandoned it. It was on the 4th evening that the small kindness came, and it came from the last direction she expected. Old Murray came down to the laundries where he had no business being. He moved by memory and by the tapping of a worn ash cane, and the laundresses fell silent at the sight of him, for he was a fixture of the house that even Lord Aldrich treated with a wary deference. Murray crossed the room as though he could see it, stopped an arm's length from Rowan, and tilted his head as a man does when he is listening to something the rest of the room cannot hear. "You breathe like someone waiting," he said quietly, "not like someone beaten. There's a difference. I've spent 60 years learning it." Rowan went still. "I don't know what you mean, sir." "You do." He said it without unkindness. "The whole house thinks you're a girl who overreached and got put in her place. I've listened to you. You don't sound put in your place. You sound like someone counting the days." He turned his sightless face toward the sound of her breathing. "I don't ask why. I only came to tell you that when the rest of them decide what you are, they're usually wrong. They were wrong about me for 30 years. Then, before she could answer, he did the thing that undid her composure more than any cruelty had. He reached into his coat and set on the shelf beside her tin box a single hawk's feather, pale, banded, perfect, the way a man might leave a token at a shrine. "For steadiness," he said, "you'll need it." And he tapped his way back toward the stair and was gone. Rowan stood a long moment with the feather in her chapped fingers, and something behind her ribs, wound tight for 2 years, ached as though it might finally loosen. She did not let it. She put the feather inside the tin box, closed the lid, and went back to the ringing. But she was not the only one who had witnessed the old man's visit. At the top of the laundry stair, half in shadow, Lord Aldrich of Corvain had stopped on his way to the mews and watched the whole of it, the blind falconer crossing a room he had no cause to enter, bending his ancient dignity toward a laundry girl, and leaving her something as though she were owed it. The Duke had meant only to pass, yet he could not move. Murray did not waste his regard. In 30 years, Aldrich had never once seen the old man seek out a servant, nor offer anything to anyone who had not earned it in a coin the falconer alone could reckon. And here he was, spending it freely on a girl the Duke himself had declared unworthy of standing beside him. "She'll never belong beside me." He had said it in front of 40 people. He had believed it. It had been, he told himself, simply true. A plain accounting of the distance between what he was and what she was. So why, watching a blind man honor her in a cellar, did the words sit so poorly in his mouth? Aldrich turned and climbed back into the light before she could see him, telling himself it was nothing, the sentiment of an old man gone soft, no more, but the image would not leave him. The girl's bowed head, the feather, the steadiness Murray had named aloud, and for the first time since the night in the hall, the Duke of Corvain felt the faint, unwelcome pressure of a doubt. He did not yet know it was the first crack, but it was. The dowager came to Thornreach at the turning of the month, as she did twice a year, and the whole house braced for her arrival the way a coast braces for weather. Lady Senate of Corvain was small, upright, and entirely without fear, having outlived 2 husbands, 3 kings, and every illusion she had ever been handed. Her eyes were the same slate gray as her son's, but where his had gone cold, hers had only sharpened. Within a day of her coming she had noticed a great deal, which servants would not meet her gaze. The scorched cuff story, which she dismissed as the invention it was, and, because Marais made certain she did, the laundry girl below stairs, whom the blind falconer had chosen to favor. That was enough to bring Rowan up from the cellars on a pretext of carrying the dowager's evening tray, and enough to make Lord Aldrich, summoned to sit with his mother, deeply uneasy about what the old woman intended. Rowan entered the west parlor with her eyes down and her steps measured, set the tray without a rattle of china, and turned to withdraw. She had nearly reached the door when the dowager spoke. "Stop there, child. Let me look at you." She stopped. She did not turn fully. A servant did not present her face to a great lady, uninvited, but she angled toward the fire so that its light fell across her, and she waited. Lady Senate looked at her for a long, unhurried moment. "You hold your shoulders like a girl who was taught deportment," she said at last. "Laundry-maid slump. You don't. Someone spent money teaching you to stand. She let that land. What's your name?" "Eloan, my lady." "Eloan what?" "Hart, my lady." "And where did Eloan Hart learn to stand like a gentlewoman?" The Duke shifted in his chair. "Mother, I'm not speaking to you." "Aldrich." She did not look away from Rowan. "I'm speaking to the only person in this room who's interested me in a fortnight." Rowan chose her words as a woman crosses a frozen river, testing each one before she set her weight on it. "I served in a household where such things were valued, my lady. Habits outlast the places that teach them." The dowager's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "A very careful answer. You'd make a poor gambler, child. You guard too well. Only people with something to lose guard like that." She lifted her cup, watching over its rim. "My son tells me you overstepped, that you forgot your place in front of the whole hall and had to be reminded of it." "Is that what happened?" Here was the trap laid plainly. To contradict the Duke before his mother was unthinkable. To agree was to sign her own diminishment. Rowan felt the fire's heat on the side of her face and the colder heat of Aldrich's attention across the room, and she found, somewhere beneath 2 years of swallowed pride, a thread of steel she had thought long spent. "I don't believe I forgot my place, my lady," she said quietly. "I believe others were reminded of theirs, and did not care for it." The room went silent. Aldrich came half out of his chair, but the dowager laughed, a short, delighted bark of a laugh that stopped her son where he stood. "There it is," she said. "There's the spine."
"I knew Marais hadn't lost his touch."
She set down her cup. "You may go, Eloan Hart, but we'll speak again. Count on it." Rowan curtsied and withdrew, and did not let herself breathe until the parlor door was shut. Inside, the dowager turned on her son. "Well," Aldrich said too sharply, "you've had your amusement at my expense. I've had nothing of the kind. I've had the first honest quarter hour I've spent in this house in a year." She studied him with a frankness only a mother could afford. "You put that girl in a cellar, Aldrich. You stood up in your own hall and told the world she'd never belong beside you. I want to know why. Because it's true." He rose and went to the window, his back to her. "Look at her, a laundry-maid. You know what belongs beside a Duke of Corvain and what does not." "Do I?" His mother's voice was very dry. "I know what your grandfather thought belonged beside a Duke of Corvain, and I know he was wrong about nearly all of it, and that it cost this family 30 years of unhappiness to learn it." She crossed to stand beside him. "Let me tell you what a blind man told me this morning, since you won't hear it from me. He said the girl doesn't sound beaten. She sounds like someone waiting, and Marais has never in his life been wrong about a person." Aldrich said nothing. "You've built your whole notion of the world on who belongs where," she went on gentler now. It's a tidy world. It lets you grieve your brother and your father without ever having to feel anything, because everything's already sorted into its box. But that girl doesn't fit the box, and it frightens you, because if she doesn't fit, then perhaps none of your boxes are as sound as you've told yourself. She laid a hand on his sleeve. There is a difference, Aldrich, between what a man deserves and what he is owed. Learn it before you're my age. I learned it too late to spare your father. She left him at the window with that, and the words lodged in him like a splinter, the kind you cannot see to remove, that works deeper with every movement until one day it reaches something vital. She sounds like someone waiting. Waiting for what? He stood a long time in the dark, and the not knowing gnawed at him more than any accusation could have. Somewhere below his feet, in a cellar he had condemned her to, a girl who stood like a gentlewoman was counting days. Toward an end he could not guess. And the Duke of Corvain, who prided himself on knowing precisely where everything in his world belonged, realized he did not know where she belonged at all. The dowager's visit changed the weather of the house, but it also shortened Rowan's time, and she knew it. Lady Sennett's interest had bought her a reprieve from the worst of the laundries. She was moved back to the upper floors, set to airing the long-shut rooms of the East Range, but interest was a double-edged gift. She was watched now. Where invisibility had let her move through Thornreach unremarked, now every servant's eye followed the girl the dowager had singled out. The window she had crossed 3 counties to reach was closing, and behind it lay the only thing that mattered, the muniment room, the locked chamber off the old library where the Corvain deeds had been kept for 200 years. It was there, she was almost certain, that the proof lay. It was there she had to go, and she would only get one attempt. Her father had told her, in the last good year before the sickness took him, of the work he had done for the old Duke, the cataloguing of the Corvain archive. He had told her something else too, that a man who wishes to hide a document does not hide it among his own, where anyone with a key may find it but among another's, where no one thinks to look. The safest place for a secret, Rowan, is inside someone else's. What she needed was not in the house she had been cast out of. It had been carried here, to Thornreach for safekeeping, and forgotten. She would have to reach the muniment room at night when the library was empty, and she would have to do it soon. She chose the night of the harvest audit, when the steward and half the senior staff would be occupied until the small hours reconciling rents in the counting house across the yard. She waited until the house had settled into its ticking quiet, then rose, dressed, tucked Murray's feather against her heart like a talisman she was half ashamed to want, and slipped into the corridor with a single shielded candle. The East Range was black and cold. She moved by 3 months' careful study, every creaking board mapped, every hinge quietly oiled under the guise of cleaning. She reached the library without a sound. The great room rose into darkness, 2 stories of books breathing out their scent of leather and dust, and at its far end stood the low arched door of the muniment room. It was locked. She had known it would be, and she had come prepared with a thing no laundry maid should own, a slender pick of blackened steel, and the knowledge, bought in her destitute year from an old woman who asked no questions of how to use it. Her hands shook. She steadied them, thinking of the feather, thinking of her father's voice. The lock was old and stubborn, and it fought her, every small scrape of metal sounding in the silence like a shout. And then, with a soft, reluctant click she felt more than heard it gave, she was inside. The muniment room was scarcely larger than a closet lined floor to ceiling with pigeonholes stuffed with rolled charters gone brown with age. Her candle threw wild shadows. She had no idea how long she had, and 200 years of records to search. She began where her father's logic pointed, not among the deeds of Corvain's own lands, but among the miscellany, the papers held on behalf of others, the safekeeping bundles a great house accumulates like silt. Her fingers flew. Charters of tenancy, a marriage settlement, letters bound in faded ribbon. And still she searched, and a candle burned down, and the wax ran hot over her fingers. And then on the third shelf, wedged behind a ledger no one had opened in a decade, she found a slim packet of oiled cloth with a name inked across it in a hand she knew better than her own. Merrick Calderon, her father's name. Her breath left her in a rush. 2 years of scrubbing and swallowing and enduring, and it was real in her fingers at last. She fumbled at the twine, needing to be certain before she dared to hope. A floorboard creaked in the library behind her. Rowan froze. Every drop of blood in her body went to ice. She pinched the candle dead between her fingers, the pain of it lost entirely in her terror, and the darkness slammed down, absolute. She pressed herself into the corner of the tiny room, the packet crushed against her chest, and she did not breathe. She could not. She listened until listening was a physical agony. Silence. Long, ringing silence. She had imagined it. The old house settling, a timber shifting in the cold, nothing more. Then, unmistakable, the slow, deliberate tread of a man crossing the library floor, not the shuffle of a servant, but the measured, unhurried step of someone who owned the ground he walked on and had never had cause to hurry across it. The Duke. He had not gone to the counting house or had gone and returned. And now he was here, moving through his own library in the dark, and between Rowan and the only door stood the whole black length of that room. She understood, with a clarity that was almost calm, how complete her ruin would be. Caught at midnight with a picked lock behind her and stolen papers against her heart, she was no longer a maid who had overstepped. She was a thief. She would not be dismissed. She would be charged. And her father's proof, her whole 2-year gamble, would vanish into a duke's evidence chest and never be seen again. Everything ended here, in the dark, 1 arm's length from the truth. She had bled, for the footsteps stopped. They were close now, just beyond the arched door, in the body of the library. She heard the soft sound of a man breathing, of cloth shifting. She heard him go still, the way a hunter goes still. And then, in a voice she had heard only once before, at full volume, on the night he had told a crowded hall that she would never belong beside him, a voice pitched low now, quiet, and absolutely certain. The Duke of Corvain spoke into the darkness. "I know you're there," he said. "I have known since the candle went out. The dark is not so kind as you hoped." A pause. She could hear her own heart. "Come out. I would rather not send for men to drag you." Rowan closed her eyes. Moray's feather was a small, hard shape over her hammering heart, and her father's packet was clutched against it, and there was nowhere left to go and no lie left to tell. She had gambled everything, and she had lost, or so she believed. In the last silent second, before she stepped out of the dark to meet him. She stepped out of the muniment room into the black of the library. The packet pressed against her heart, and she did not run, because there was nowhere to run to. "Here," she said. Her voice came steadier than she had any right to expect.
I am here.
"There is no need to send for anyone." She heard him move. A single step, then the scrape and flare of a match, and light bloomed gold as the Duke touched flame to a lamp on the library table. He turned it up until the near half of the room swam into being. The tiers of books, the cold hearth, and the man himself, coatless, looking at her across 10 feet of carpet with an expression she could not read. For a long moment, neither spoke. He had expected. She saw almost anything but this. Not a thief bolting, not a servant weeping, but a small, straight-backed girl standing perfectly still in his library at 2 in the morning, meeting his eyes. "You," he said at last. He knew her. Then, the wine girl. The one he had put in her place. "What in God's name are you doing in my library?" "I could not sleep, Your Grace." The lie was thin and they both knew it. You could not sleep. His voice was very quiet, and quiet in him, she was learning, was more dangerous than shouting. So you dressed, came down through a locked house to the one room kept locked against the very servants, and let yourself into my muniment room, which is locked with a key I keep on my own person. His eyes went to the packet she had not been quick enough to hide behind her skirts. And you hold something that belongs to me. We have a plain word for that, girl. It does not belong to you. The words were out before she could stop them. She saw them land. She saw his head come up. It was the wrong thing to say, the reckless, ruinous, true thing. And having said it, she could not take it back. And some part of her, the part that had knelt in the dust of a lawyer's chamber and been called mad, did not want to. It does not belong to me, he repeated slowly. A serving woman breaks into my archive in the dead of night and informs me that what she is stealing is not mine to keep. He came a step nearer, the lamplight cutting hard across his face. Explain that, and choose your words with care, because the next thing you say decides whether I send for my steward or for the magistrate. She stood at the edge of the cliff she had been walking toward for 2 years, and she looked down into it, and she made her choice. If I explain, she said, you will not believe me, and if you do not believe me, it will make no difference whether you send for your steward or the magistrate, because I will be ruined either way, so I will not beg your grace. I will only ask you one thing first. She lifted her chin, the name on the packet in my hand. Will you read it? It was not what he had braced for. She watched suspicion war with a colder, sharper thing, curiosity, the scholar's itch he had buried under grief and duty, but never quite killed. He held out his hand. After a moment, she crossed the carpet, laid the packet in it, and stepped back. He turned it to the light and read the inked name, the same she had glimpsed, by candlelight, in the instant before the dark came down. Calderon, he said, I know this name. You would, your grace. Your father knew it better. His eyes came up to her face, and now there was no sarcasm left in them at all. Explain, he said again, but the word had changed. It was no longer a threat, it was very nearly a request. And so, standing in the ruin of her only plan, with the proof of her life in another man's hands, Rowan Calderon did the thing she had not done in 2 years. She told the truth, not all of it, not in a rush at 2 in the morning to a man who held her freedom in his fist, but enough. She told him that her father had been a scholar, that he had catalogued this very archive for the old duke, that he had died, and that after his death a great wrong had been done, a wrong she had come north to undo, and that she had good reason, a dying friend's testimony, to believe her father had left something in this house's safe keeping that would prove it. She did not say forgery. She did not say my name is not Eloan. She gave him the shape of the thing without its dangerous heart. A serving woman, he said when she had finished, whose father catalogued my father's library. His gaze moved over her, the reddened hands, the coarse gown, and something else he was only now permitting himself to see. You said just now that you would not beg. You said it as though begging were a thing beneath you. He shook his head once as if to clear it. Tell me, the packet in my hand, what language are the papers within? I do not know, your grace. I have not opened it. I found it not a quarter hour before you came, but you could read them, if you had. A pause. The whole world balanced on it. Yes, said Rowan. He set the lamp down, crossed to the shelf, drew down a book at random, and held it out across the space between them. A slim volume dense with the crabbed Greek of some ancient philosopher. Read, he said, aloud, from there. And there was a challenge in it, and beneath the challenge, something almost like a plea to be proven wrong about everything he had believed since the night of the feast. Rowan took the book. Her hands, that had picked a lock without trembling, trembled now. She found the line his thumb had marked, drew a breath, and began to read. And the ancient words came off her tongue clean and sure, the accents true, the sense plain in the way she shaped the phrases. the reading of a woman who had learned this language at her father's knee before she had learned to launder a shirt. She read half a page before he lifted his hand and she stopped. The Duke of Corvain was staring at her as though the floor of his ordered world had opened beneath his feet. He had told the hall full of witnesses that she would never belong beside him. He had believed it as he believed in stone and season. And now here she stood in the lamplight, a laundry maid reading Greek more purely than he could read it himself, holding a packet marked with a name his own father had honored, and every certainty he owned was cracking down its length like ice in a thaw. "Who are you?" he said, and Rowan, who had come so far and dared so much, and stood now one word away from either salvation or the abyss, looked back at him and did not answer, because she did not yet dare to, and because she saw, in his ruined face, that for the first time the master of Thornreach was truly afraid of the answer. He did not send for the magistrate. He did not send for anyone. He stood a long while with the marked book still open, then closed it and set it down with a care that seemed to cost him something. And when he spoke again, his voice had lost its edge. "You will not answer me," he said. "No. I think perhaps you are wise not to." He looked at the packet on the table, her father's name inked across it. "If I name what you have done tonight by its plain word, no testimony could save you. A serving woman's account against a duke's. You know this. I know it, your grace, and yet you told me the truth. Some of it." His gray eyes searched her. "A cleverer thief would have wept and sworn she was lost in the dark. You handed me the very thing that condemns you and dared me to read the name on it. That is not the act of someone protecting herself, but of someone who has decided the truth is worth more than her own skin. I have known men at court who would not risk a coin on the truth. And here is a laundry maid who has wagered her freedom on it." Rowan said nothing. She had learned, long ago, when silence served better than any answer. The Duke turned from her and walked to the cold hearth and stood with his back to her, one hand braced on the marble, and she understood that he was not deciding her fate that had already, somehow, in the last quarter of an hour, been decided, but wrestling with something in himself. "My father," he said at last to the dead fire, "kept this archive as other men keep their souls. And I remember now, I was a boy, but I remember, a scholar who came one summer and stayed 3 months, who my father spoke of afterward with more warmth than most of his own blood. A southern man, a widower, with a great love of the old languages." He turned his head. "I did not remember the name until I read it just now." "Calderon?" "Yes," Rowan said quietly. "Your father, yes." He absorbed it. "Then you are not what you have let this house believe you are. It was not a question. The hands are true enough. You have done hard work, and long. But the rest is a costume, the gown, the downcast eyes, the name you gave the steward, a Lowen heart, his mouth twisted not unkindly. You are as much a Lowen heart as I am." She held very still. She had not confirmed it, but she had not needed to. He had arrived at it himself, and there was no unpicking it now. "I could ask you your true name," he went on. "I find I will not tonight. A name given under duress is worth nothing, and I have taken enough from you already." He came back toward the table and stopped, and looked down at the packet, and did not touch it. "This is yours." I believe that now, though this morning I would have laughed at the notion. But I cannot simply give it into your hands and send you back to the laundries as though nothing had passed. If what it contains is what you believe it to be, then it is not a thing to be smuggled out in an apron pocket. It is a thing that will have to be proven before witnesses, before law, in a manner no man like the one who wronged you can twist or deny. His jaw set, which means it must be done carefully. And it means, for now, that this stays where it is. Rowan's heart clenched. "Your Grace." "Locked," he said, "in my muniment room, where it has lain safe for years and will lie safe a few weeks more." He met her stricken look steadily. "But if you take it now and run, A clever man will have a dozen reasons ready why a discharged servant's stolen papers are forgeries, and you will have handed him the rope to hang your truth with. Bring it to light properly from the Duke of Corvain's archive, under the Duke of Corvain's own seal and word, and no one alive can gainsay it. He paused. I am offering you something, girl. Do you understand what it is? She understood it so completely that for a moment she could not speak. He was offering the one thing she had lacked for 2 years, and could never have won for herself standing. The voice of a great house behind her small stolen truth. It changed everything, and it meant placing her whole fate in the hands of a man who, weeks before, had humiliated her before 40 people. Why? She managed. That night, I was a creature who would never belong beside you. Your own words, your grace, before your whole hall. Why would you lift a finger for me? Now she saw the shot go home. He was silent a moment, and when he answered, it was with a bleak, plain honesty that surprised her more than anger would have. Because I was wrong, he said. I do not say those words often, but I stood in that hall and pronounced on you as if I could read your whole soul from a spilled cup, and I was wrong in every particular, and a blind man in my own muse saw more of the truth in you in a fortnight than I saw in 11 weeks with 2 good eyes. He drew a breath. My mother told me there is a difference between what a man deserves and what he is owed. You are owed something, Calderon's daughter, and this house helped to keep it from you. I will not compound that. Go back to your room before the house wakes. Speak of this to no one, and trust me a little further than I have given you cause to. Rowan looked at him a long moment. This proud, cold, grieving man cracked suddenly open, and she made the second great wager of the night. Then keep it safe, she said, and I will trust you, your grace. But know this, the man who wronged me has a long reach and a longer patience. If he learns those papers exist before we are ready, they will not stay safe in any room, behind any key. We will not have weeks. We may not have days. Then, said the Duke of Corvain, and for the first time since she had known him something kindled in his face that was neither pride nor grief but the clean, hard light of purpose, we had best be quicker than he is. And Rowan Calderon walked back up through the sleeping house in the gray dawn, carrying no papers, and yet carrying everything. For she had come to Thornreach with a single ally in a blind old falconer, and left the library that night with the master of the house himself sworn, however warily, to her cause. She did not let herself weep until her door was shut, and then she wept, not from fear for once, but from the terrible, unfamiliar ache of hope. The Duke moved quickly, as he had promised, and for 11 days it seemed quickness would be enough. He did it without fanfare. Rowan was lifted quietly out of the laundries and given a place, on the thin pretext that the neglected library wanted ordering, as a kind of under-librarian, a post beneath the Duke's notice, yet elevated enough that she might come and go from the library without remark. In the mornings she worked among the shelves in plain sight, and in low voices over an open ledger, she and the Duke laid their siege against a wrong 2 years old. He had opened the packet on the second night, breaking the seal with his own hands, and spreading its contents under the lamp, and Rowan had looked down at her father's writing for the first time in 2 years and had to grip the table's edge to stay standing. It was there, all of it. The true will of Lord Merrick Calderon drawn and witnessed a full year before the forged one, leaving the whole estate to my only child and heir, Rowan Merle Calderon, in the certain knowledge of her wisdom and her worth, the deeds, and, most damning, a letter in her father's hand to the old Duke, begging his friend to keep these papers close, confessing his fear of my late wife's cousin, one Corbin Ashfen, whose eyes I have seen resting on what is not his, and charging the Duke, should anything befall him, to see it all came into his daughter's hands. The old Duke had died before he could keep that charge, and the papers had lain forgotten in the archive of a house in mourning, while a forger helped himself to a girl's whole life. It is beyond doubt Aldrich had said, low, when he had read it all. No court could look at these and the forgery together and fail to see which hand lies. Your father built you a fortress, Calderon's daughter. He only died before he could give you the key. It looked at her with something like awe. You have been right all along, and known it alone for 2 years, and said nothing, and waited. I do not think I have the measure of your courage even now. They had made their plan. Aldrich was already writing to an incorruptible man of law in the capital, of a standing even Ashfin could not buy or frighten. He would lay the matter before the assize and swear to the papers' provenance from his father's archive under his own seal. A few weeks to do it unassailably. And then Rowan Calderon would walk back into the world under her own name, with a duke's word behind her, and the law's weight beside her, and Corbin Ashfin would answer for what he had done. It was the enemy's reach that they had not reckoned dearly enough, for Thornreach was a house with a memory, and one thread of it ran, though Rowan had not known it, straight to the man who had ruined her. The understeward's wife, a sour, watchful woman named Peasley, who had hated Rowan from the day the Duke plucked her out of the laundries, was Corbin Ashfin's creature. A distant connection planted years past in a great northern house, as such men plant seeds against the day one might sprout. She had watched the wine girl's strange elevation with a jealousy that curdled into suspicion. And on the 11th day, while Rowan and the Duke walked in the park, she had tried the muniment door, found it locked, and put her eye to the crack, and seen an oiled packet, a spread of old papers, and a wax seal she did not know, but thought a careful master might. She could not read them. She did not need to. She knew only that the girl the Duke had lifted from nothing guarded a box she let no one touch, and that a great man was secretly at labor over old documents on her behalf. It was enough to write down. Peasley had long ago been given an address in the South to which anything of interest concerning strangers of good speech and hidden pasts might profitably be sent. The letter went south on the 12th morning in the ordinary post, folded in among a dozen innocent others, and no one at Thornreach marked it go. Rowan felt the change before she understood it, Peasley's eyes following her too long, a silence that fell a beat too sharply when she entered the servants' hall, the prickle at the back of her neck that the fragile safety Aldrich had built around her had sprung a leak she could not see. She went to the mews. Marais was hooding a young falcon, and he turned his blind face to her before she had spoken, and frowned. You've a fear on you, a fresh one, different from the old waiting fear. What's changed? She sat beside him, and told him, because he was the one soul at Thornreach besides the Duke she trusted, of the eyes and the silences she could not name. The old man worked the hood. A long moment. The steward's wife, he said finally. Peasley. Why do you say so? Because a house tells me things it never means to. She's been to the library twice this week, when the Duke was out of it, and stood a long while, and gone soft away. His ruined eyes turned toward her. She came to us from the South, girl, placed here by some grand connection none of us ever saw. A bird said in a muse. It wasn't hatched in answers to a hand you can't see. If you've a secret in this house and an enemy in the wide world, that woman is the crack between the two. The cold came up through Rowan, slow and total, like water rising in a well. A girl alone, with no name and no coin, who goes about crying forgery, will find herself reckoned mad, or worse. Ashfin's own soft warning. 2 years gone, he had not left it to chance. He had planted his watchers wide against exactly this day, and one of them had been standing in the great house of Corvain the whole while, and Rowan had walked past her 100 times and never known the enemy was already inside the walls. She rose. I have to warn the Duke. If Ashfin learns those papers exist before we are ready. Then go, said Marais. Go now, girl. And go quiet. He caught her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. The reach of a wicked man is long, but it is not quick, Not from the south to here. You've a little time, days maybe. But mind me on one thing. A cornered man is the most dangerous kind there is. Whatever your duke does now, tell him to do it fast. The moment Ashvin knows his forgery can be undone, he'll not wait to be undone by it. He'll come. Or he'll send. And it won't be with lawyers. Rowan ran for the house with her heart in her throat, and the 11 days of fragile hope curdled behind her into something colder. For the race she had thought she was winning had, without her knowing, already been joined by the man who had stolen her life, and she no longer knew who would reach the finish first. He came himself. That was the measure of his fear, though Rowan did not understand it as fear, until long after a guilty man of ordinary nerve would have sent lawyers or letters. Corban Ashvin, reading Peasley's careful hand by his own fire, understood at once that letters would not serve, that the one thing capable of undoing him was loose in the world at last in the archive of a duke no bribe could reach. And so he did the thing that undid him. He got on a horse. He arrived 8 days after Rowan's warning, with 2 men at his back, and a lawyer of his own, and a story ready-made that a dangerous impostor had wormed her way into the Duke's household, a discharged servant and known thief who had once tried to claim the honest estate of Calderon, and that he had come as her nearest kin to take the wretched creature in hand before she could deceive a great man further. He had not reckoned on the Duke of Corvain being ready for him, for Aldrich had not been idle. Warned by Rowan, spurred by Moray's grim counsel, he had moved with a speed she had not known he possessed. The letters to the capital had gone by fast riders under seal. The incorruptible man of law, one Sergeant Aldous Vane, whose reputation for immovability was known even in the north, had been begged to come with all haste, and was, on the morning Ashvin clattered into the forecourt, sitting in a room off the great hall with the Calderon papers spread before him and his verdict already formed. And the Duke had done one thing more. He had sent word to his mother, and the Dowager Lady Senate had come down in her old black traveling cloak because she would not for the world have missed it. So when Corban Ashvin strode into the great hall of Thornreach, the very hall where a duke had told the serving girl she would never belong beside him, he strode into a trap dressed as a courtesy. The hall was full. Aldrich had seen to that, as many witnesses now as on the night of the feast, gentry and household ranged along the walls. He would have this done in the open, so no man could ever after whisper it into a private lie. "Your Grace." Ashvin bowed, smooth and deep, a soft-featured man running to fat, his voice all oil and regret. "You are gracious to receive me. I come on a painful errand. A woman, in your service calling herself Hart, has practiced a deception upon your household. It grieves me to say she is known to me. A person of unsound mind who once brought a monstrous false claim against my own family's estate and was put out for it. I have come to remove her before she can do more harm." "Have you?" said the Duke. He was seated at the head of the hall, and he did not rise, and something in the flatness of the 2 words made Ashvin's smooth face falter for the first time. "I have here," Aldrich went on, "a woman calling herself Hart. You are right in that." He lifted a hand, and from the side of the hall, dressed no longer in laundry gray, but in a plain gown of dark good cloth the dowager had found for her, her head high and her hands still for once, Rowan came forward and stood before them all. "Though the name is not the one her father gave her. Perhaps, Master Ashvin, you would do us the service of telling this company her true name. You seem to know so much of her." The silence in the hall was absolute. Ashvin wet his lips. "Aye, her name is of no consequence." "She is an impostor, your Grace." Her name," said the Duke, rising now, slow and terrible, "is Rowan Merle Calderon, only child and lawful heir of Lord Merrick Calderon, late of Calderon Cross." His voice rang the length of the hall. "The estate you hold, sir, taken by a will, your own hired man forged within a week of an honest man's death. The estate whose lawful mistress you cast into the gutter with 100 crowns and a warning to hold her tongue, and who has spent 2 years and more courage than you own, tracing the proof of your crime to the one place you were too stupid to think of, my father's archive, where her father, trusting his friend, had hidden the truth, years before you dreamed of stealing anything. Lies, Ashfin said, but his voice had thinned to a reed. Fantasies. The papers are forgeries, hers. The papers, said a new voice, dry as old parchment, are genuine. And I will stake my name and my office upon it before any court in this kingdom. Sergeant Vane had come from the side room, documents in hand. A spare, pitiless old man, he laid the true will and the forged one side by side before the whole hall and named, in his flat lawyer's voice, the marks that damned the false one, the hand that faltered where a true hand flowed, the ink too fresh for its date, the seal pressed by a man who had never seen the true one. He read aloud Lord Merrick's letter to the old Duke. I fear the eyes of one Corbin Ashfin, resting on what is not his, and at the sound of his own name in a dead man's warning, spoken before 40 witnesses, something went out of Corbin Ashfin, and he seemed to shrink inside his fine coat. It is, Vane concluded, as clear a case of forgery and false conveyance as I have seen in 40 years at the law. The estate of Calderon reverts wholly to Lord Merrick's lawful heir, and the forger will answer for it at the assize, where I shall take particular care to see the matter through myself. Ashfin made one last floundering effort. He turned toward Rowan herself, the girl he had ruined, thinking her still the frightened thing he had cast out, and tried the oldest weapon he had. Rowan, he said, low and wheedling. Child, there has been a terrible misunderstanding. Come away with me now, quietly, and we will settle all of this between family, as your dear father would have. My father, said Rowan, would not have let you through the gate. She had not raised her voice. She did not need to. 2 years of swallowed words were behind it, and it fell in the silent hall like a blade laid flat on a table. You called me mad when I said the will was false because you knew a girl alone, with no name and no witnesses, would be believed by no one. For 2 years, you were right. She stepped closer, and he gave ground without seeming to know he did it. But I did not cry forgery in the streets, as you warned me not to. I held my tongue exactly as you bid me, and came here, to the one house where my father had left me a sword, and waited, and said nothing, until I could say it where it could not be unsaid. She lifted her chin. You should not have taught me patience, sir, by making me destitute. I learned it too well. And Corbin Ashfin, who had stolen a name and an estate in 2 years of a woman's life, found that he had nothing left to say at all. Duke gestured, and his men took Ashfin by either arm and led him from the hall of Thornreach past the ranked and silent witnesses, and at the door the Dowager Lady Senate, who had watched the whole of it with her hard, bright eyes, said in a voice pitched to carry after him, You came north to take a madwoman in hand, sir. Do give my regards to the assize. And the hall at that began at last to breathe, and then to murmur, and then to roar. The law, once it turned thoroughly. Sergeant Vane was as good as his cold word. The assize met that winter, and the case was so plain, and the old lawyer so relentless, that even Ashfin's hired advocates scarcely troubled to fight it. The forged will was struck down, the true one proved and entered. The estate of Calderon Cross, with all its lands and the great house Rowan had been born in, reverted wholly to her, along with 2 years' withheld income that Vane pursued to the last crown. Corbin Ashfin, stripped of everything he had stolen and much he had come by honestly, went from the assize to a debtor's confinement, and from there, for the forger and the corrupted lawyer both turned upon him to save their own necks, to a sentence that put the whole matter beyond his reach forever. And Rowan Merle Calderon walked out of the world's shadow and back into her name. It did not feel as she had dreamed it would in the long, cold nights of her exile. She had imagined triumph, a great, bright, rushing thing. What she felt instead, standing in the recovered hall of Calderon Cross with the winter light coming through her father's windows, was quieter and far deeper, a settling the sensation of a dislocated thing sliding home. She walked the rooms of her childhood and touched the spines of her father's books, restored to their shelves, and she wept for him freely, for the first time since the fever took him. And the tears, when they came, were the grief finally permitted, the mourning of a daughter too long, too busy surviving to mourn. She did not do it alone. That was the part she had never dreamed, because she had spent 2 years learning to expect nothing from anyone. The Duke of Corvain had stood beside her through the whole of it, not as a benefactor dispensing charity, which he was careful never to become, but as a man discharging a debt of honor he believed his own house had helped incur. He had given his testimony at the assize plainly, lent her his lawyers and his standing, and advanced a loan so tactfully that she could accept it without shame and repay it within the year. And when it was done, when the estate was hers past disputing, he did the thing that told her how she had misjudged him on the night of the feast. He bowed to her, a small, precise, formal bow, the bow one great person makes to another, and said, "I owe you an apology, Lady Calderon, that I have owed since the night I first mistook you. I told a hall full of people that you would never belong beside me. I was a proud fool who read a whole soul from a spilled cup of wine." He had straightened and met her eyes. "You were the finest born person in that hall that night, and the only one in it with any real dignity, and I could not see it because I had decided what you were before I ever troubled to look. I have thought a great deal since about what my mother told me, that there is a difference between what a person deserves and what they are owed. You were owed a great deal, my lady. I am glad to have paid some small part of it. I am sorrier than I can say that my house was ever party to the withholding." And Rowan, who had once curtsied to the same man in the same hall while 40 people watched to see her break, looked at him a long moment and answered, "You could have kept those papers, your grace. You could have burned them or let them lie. No one living knew they were there. Instead, you spent your name and your peace to give a laundry maid back her life. I think perhaps you are not the man who spoke to me on the night of the feast." A faint smile. "Or he is not the whole of you. I am content to have met the rest." There was more between them by then than either would say. It had grown in the quiet hours over an open ledger, in the shared look across a hall, in the long, slow business of setting a wrong to right side by side. But neither spoke it. The gulf that had opened on the night of the feast had closed, and something else had opened in its place, tentative and unnamed. And both of them, being proud and careful people much alike beneath their differences, let it lie. There was time. For the first time in either of their lives, there seemed to be time. One went home to Calderon Cross to take up the life that had been stolen from her, and she found that she had brought something back from Thornreach besides her name. She had gone north a frightened fugitive with a lie for a name and a secret in a tin box. She came home, a woman who had faced the man who ruined her across a crowded hall and watched him crumble, and who had learned, in the doing, that the patience and swallowed pride exile had beaten into her were not weakness, but a kind of strength that could outlast even a wicked man's long reach. Mary had named it once. "You sound like someone waiting." She had waited, and the waiting had not broken her. It had forged her. She did not yet know what the world would make of Rowan Calderon restored. She knew only that the girl who had carried wine down the length of a scornful hall was gone for good, and that whatever came next, she would meet it standing. The crown she had truly come for, her name, her father's honor, the proof of her own worth against a world that had called her nobody, was hers at last. She did not yet dream there might be another kind of crown still waiting, further up the road than she could see. 3 years passed, as years do, and they carried Rowan Calderon further than she had ever thought to go. It began with the land, and with the plain fact that Lord Merrick had raised his daughter to run what she inherited. Calderon Cross had gone to seed under Ashfin's neglect. Rowan restored it, then improved it, managing her lands with a sense and fairness that made her tenants prosper and her neighbors take note. But it did not stop at her borders. The story of her, the wronged heiress who had traced her own forgery to a duke's archive and undone it before the assize, spread first as gossip and then as something more, until it reached the one court in the kingdom always hungry for people of proven wit and unimpeachable honor. For the kingdom was changing. An old king had died, and a young queen had come to a troubled throne, clearing out the soft, corrupt men of her father's day, and looking urgently for others, for minds that could not be bought. Sergeant Vane, risen high himself by then, put a name before her. There is a woman in the north, he said, who taught herself law out of grief, and beat a forger at his own game, with nothing but patience and truth. If your grace wants an honest officer, I know none more thoroughly proven. The queen sent for her, and Rowan Calderon, who had once carried wine in a grey stuff gown, went to court. She rose there as she had risen everywhere, quietly, by being exactly what she seemed, and better at her work than anyone expected. Commissioner of the Northern Crown Lands, then Keeper of the Royal Archives, a post that made her laugh aloud, alone the day it was given her, thinking of a picked lock and a candle pinched out in the dark. And in time, she was raised higher still, created countess in her own right, given the governance of a whole northern province in the Queen's name, so that when the Queen rode north in the 5th year of her reign, it was to the Countess Calderon's province that she came, and Rowan who rode at her right hand. The Queen's progress passed, on its way, through the country of the Dukes of Corvain, and so Rowan Calderon came again to Thornreach, not up the servants' passage this time, but through the great gates, in the Queen's own train, one of the highest in the land. The Duke of Corvain received his sovereign, as he must in the great hall. It was the same hall. 200 candles were lit again, the same high table caught the same gold light, the same northern gentry ranged along the walls, many of them Rowan saw, the very faces that had watched her curtsy and walk out unbroken 5 years and a whole life ago. She wore no grey gown now, but the deep colors and chain of office of her rank, and on her brow, because she rode in the Queen's own company, sat the slender coronet of her countship, not a great crown, but a crown catching the candlelight, as she came down the hall a half-step behind her queen. Aldrich of Corvain came forward to make his obeisance to his sovereign, as the law and custom of the realm required. He bowed low to the young queen, and she gave him her hand and spoke him fair. And then the queen, who knew the whole of the story, for Rowan had told her one long night on the road north, and the queen had a taste for justice and a longer memory than most sovereigns. The queen turned, with the faintest and most deliberate of smiles, and said, "You know the Countess Calderon, I think, my Lord Duke. She tells me she was once, briefly, a guest beneath your roof." The hall went very still. And the Duke of Corvain turned from his queen to the woman at her side, and for a long moment the whole of 5 years hung between them. The spilled wine, the scornful words, the locked room, the candle in the dark, the bow he had made her in the winter light at Calderon Cross when he first spoke her true name. Then Aldrich of Corvain in his own great hall, before the same 40 faces that had watched him cast her down, went down upon one knee to Rowan Calderon and bowed his head, and did not raise his eyes. It was more than the courtesy owed her rank, and everyone knew it. A duke bows to those the crown has raised above him, that is, form alone. But Aldrich knelt, and knelt low, in the exact spot where he had once stood to tell a serving girl she would never belong beside him, and there was in the bend of his proud neck something no mere form required, a plain, public, unhidden penance offered where the wound had first been given. "Your Grace of Corvain," and her voice carried the length of the hall as his had once carried, "you may rise." He rose. He met her eyes, and she saw in his weathered face that he remembered, to the word, exactly what he had said in this room, and had carried it all these years, as she had once carried her father's name, a thing that would not be set down until it had been answered. There was a night in this hall, he said, low, for her, and yet not troubling to hide it from the rest, when I told you that you would never belong beside me. I have waited 5 years to say, where the same walls could hear it, that I was wrong. It is not that you belong beside me, my lady. A breath. It is that I could never have hoped to stand beside you. I see that now. I believe I saw it long ago and was too proud to bear it. Rowan looked at him. At the man who had humbled her, and then at cost to himself, had helped to lift her, who had been wrong in the worst way. A proud man can be wrong, and who had spent the years since making it right without once asking anything of her for the doing. And she found that the old wound, when she reached for it, had healed clean. We were both of us something on that night that we are not now, Your Grace, she said gently. You spoke as a man who thought he knew what people were worth by where they stood. And I stood there and let you, because I dared not do otherwise. A small smile touched her mouth. We have neither of us stood still since. I think that is the most that can be asked of anyone. Later, when the Queen's business was done and the hall had emptied, the two of them walked out into the cold, clear evening, down toward the mews where an old blind falconer, frail now but living still, kept the birds he could not see. Mare heard their 2 sets of footsteps and turned his ruined face toward them and smiled his knowing smile, for he had reckoned the truth of both of them long before either had dared to. What passed between the Duke and the Countess in the years that followed is another story, and a quieter one. It is enough to say that the gulf which had opened between them on the night of a spilled cup of wine had, by slow degrees, become a bridge, and that whether they crossed it wholly, or only stood upon it a long while looking at one another across the last of the distance, they crossed it as equals at last, the one thing that proud Knight had sworn could never be. For the girl who had been told she would never belong beside a duke had not, in the end, needed to belong beside anyone. She had gone and got a crown of her own, and the man who had scorned her had lived to bow before it, not because the law compelled him, but because at long and humbling last he had learned to see.